Every weapon in Space Engineers ranked. Space Engineers only used to have 4 different types of weapons to mount your ships. However, with the release of Warfare 2, we now have 4 new weapons to use. From Gatling Cannons to Warheads to the almighty Railgun, there's now loads of choice when it comes to arming your ships. Maybe too much choice. So, in this video, we're going to cover each of the game's weapons, ranking each of them and how good they are, and most importantly, ascertaining which weapon in Space Engineers is the best. So, without further ado, let's begin. The first weapon we're going to be looking at is the interior turret, and the interior turret is a bit of a weird one. First of all, it's large grid only, and it only has a turret variant. It doesn't have a static variant like a lot of the other weapons have. It doesn't automatically reload, it has to be manually loaded up with ammo clips, and it has a range of about 600 meters. It fires 10 shots a second, so around 600 a minute, and it does about 15 damage a shot, meaning it has around 150 DPS. It's not great if I'm honest. It doesn't do a lot of damage at all compared to every other weapon on this list, but it's not meant to, I guess is the point. The interior turret is mainly used to shoot at players, not at blocks. Whilst it can be used to shoot at small grids and stuff, it's very good at shooting players, which I guess is the purpose, but it only excels at that one thing, whereas a lot of the other weapons on this list can do multiple roles. So I guess this is going to go at a C on the tier list, as it's perfectly average at what it's meant to do and not much else. So next up is the Gatling gun. So the Gatling gun has a static variant for small grid and a turret on both large and small grid. It automatically reloads, it has a range of 800 meters, it fires around 700 shots a minute, which is about 11.5 shots a second. Each shot does 90 damage, so 5 times as much as the interior turret, which makes it do about 1000 damage a second. Now, the Gatling gun, considering it's been in the game for so long, is very good. It's probably one of the best weapons in the game. It might not do a lot of damage here, it does more than the interior turret obviously, but compared to the weapons coming out later, it doesn't do as much. However, its biggest asset is the fact it shoots so fast. Whilst later weapons will do a lot more damage per shot, because this thing is shooting constantly, it means it has more chance to hit and more chance of that damage to actually connect. If you think about it this way, if you fire one rocket and it hits, you do a lot of damage. But if you fire one rocket and it misses, you've done no damage. If you've got a Gatling gun, it doesn't matter if one shot misses, because you've got another 11 shots shooting in that second. And I think that's one thing a lot of people don't think about when they put weapons on the ship. It's not about how much damage you can output, it's about how much damage actually connects with the enemy ship. So with that, I'm going to put the Gatling gun at S rank on the tier list. Missiles are weird. They have a static variant for both large grid and small grids. In fact, they have 2 for small grids, one that can't be reloaded automatically and one that can. And additionally, they have a turret variant for the large and small grid as well. They have the same range as the Gatling gun, so about 800 meters. And the small grid static variant fires about 1 missile a second. The large grid variant shoots about 2, but it shoots it in a 16 shot burst, so it's actually quite a bit faster, which makes targeting the DPS quite difficult. And then the turret shoots about 1.5 missiles a second. Each of these missiles do 500 damage, but they do it in an AoE rather than on a certain area. So when the missile connects, it hits all the blocks around it. Gives it about 500 damage per second with the small grid variants, 1000 damage per second on the large grid static variant, and 750 DPS from a turret. Now, there's one big main problem with this. Now, on paper, this is about equivalent to the Gatling gun, but in reality, it's not. It fires less shots a second, which means each shot is more valuable than the Gatling gun. As each misses, it's more damage lost. So to top that off, you can shoot missiles down, which you cannot do with any other weapon in the game. Well, maybe one weapon coming up later, but for the most part, it's just missiles are effective with this. Which means not only do you have a chance if your weapon's missing, they can also, even if they were going to hit, they could get shot down. To add to that again, missiles are the most expensive ammo type in the game, costing both platinum and uranium to build, and they're the only weapons to cost platinum, which is, not great, as platinum is one of the rarest resources in the game. And I cannot believe these didn't get changed with Warfare. Like, there are weapons in Warfare now that do the job the missile launcher does, and they're just better. It's not like the missile launcher was good before, it was always outclassed by the Gatling gun previously, but it's just not good. I hope one day Keen do fix this, but at the moment I'm going to put the missile launcher as a D on the tier list. There is no situation I can think of where I'd use a missile launcher over any other weapon in the game. Next up, the last weapon that was in the game before Warfare 2, the Warhead. I'm going to say this straight away, the Warhead is terrible, and I mean absolutely awful. They are very expensive to make. You have to build a delivery method to actually hit other ships with them. Most of the methods we have aren't very reliable, and even if you do, the Warhead doesn't do a lot of damage to heavy armor. Like, think about this, a Warhead costs whatever materials it does, and then you have to build your delivery method. So say you build a missile, you have to calculate all the components of the missile into that weapon. You're firing a ship's worth of materials at each missile, and then you still has to hit. And because it is a ship, that means your Warhead can actually be shot down like actual missiles can be, which means it has all the weaknesses of missiles, and it's more expensive. One other thing to keep in mind as well is the amount of effort required to use a Warhead. Because not only do you have to build a ship to deliver it, you also have to set up, whether it be a custom turret controller or a script, to fire them. And by the time you've done all of that, the end result just isn't that great. Now, I will give Warheads one thing. They do a lot of damage if they connect, and whilst they don't do a lot of damage to heavy armor, if you hit a component with it, it's basically gone, and if you shoot it at like a base, like it does like a massive AoE underneath. And Warheads also do a massive voxel AoE, so I guess they're more useful as like mines and stuff than they are as weapons. So I think just for that, I'm going to put the Warhead as a C, but overall, I can't see myself using Warheads as weapons. There's just too much effort involved in getting them to work. So that's all the old weapons done, let's cover the new weapons added in Warfare 2. Before we get to the Warfare 2 weapons, I'd just like to mention I'll be leaving a link to the tier list in the description. This way you can create your own rankings for Space Engineers' weapons. I'd love to see your rankings for the weapons as well. I'm sure some of you definitely have your disagreements, so there's also a link to my Discord in the description where you can share them with me. Anyway, back to the video. The autocannon is great. I'm not gonna lie, it's one of my favourite new weapons added to the game. It's small grid only, having both a static and turret variant. It auto reloads, it has the same range as the Gatling gun, however it has a slower fire rate, only firing 2.5 rounds a second and about 150 rounds a minute, but each shot does about 500 damage, leading to a higher DPS than the Gatling gun of 1250. Now, it still fires slower than the Gatling gun, yes, however, it does enough damage to give it a higher DPS than the Gatling gun, and it still has that philosophy of shooting faster, meaning that the value of each of your shots is less, meaning that missing isn't as much of an issue. It also makes a really nice sound when it fires. I think the main role of the autocannon is to fight heavier craft, because Gatling guns kind of deal a lot of damage to light armor but shoot fast and don't deal as much damage to heavy armor. Now these deal more damage and shoot fast, so I'm guessing they're kind of that middle of the road weapon for like fighters and stuff for shooting down heavier ships. But overall I quite rank the autocannon. I'm going to put it in A for now, we might change it later, but for the most part this is a good contender for the Gatling gun. Next up we have the assault cannon, and again I really like the assault cannon. So it has a static variant for small grid only, there is no large grid variant of it, however there is a large grid turret variant and there's also a small grid turret variant as well. It auto reloads, every weapon after this auto reloads, I'm just bringing it up because it's worth that two of the weapons don't. It has a much longer range than all previous weapons, boasting a 1400 meter range, being just under 50% of higher range than all the weapons we've covered so far. The large grid turret fires around 20 rounds a minute, roughly a shot every 3 seconds, and the small grid variant does about half of that, as it only has one barrel, firing 10 shots a minute, or about a shot every 6 seconds. Now each shot does around 4000 damage, which is much more than every weapon we've covered so far. So because of this fire rate and high damage, it has around 13,000 damage per second on large grid, and about 666 DPS on small grids. Now, like I said, I really like this. It's just a better missile launcher in my opinion. Now the only downside is it doesn't do the AoE that the missile launcher, but it does so much more damage per shot than it does. Again, it shoots faster, not as fast as every other weapon, not even as fast as the missile launcher. However, because it can't be shot down, it just gives it that leg up over the missile launcher. I'm gonna be honest, if you were covering any ships with missile launchers previously, I would just replace them all with the assault cannons. They're so much better for that high DPS blowing up components off your enemy ship's purpose. So with that, I'm gonna put the assault cannon as a B. The only thing that brings it down from not being an A is the fact that it shoots so slow compared to the Gatling cannon and the autocannon. And again, it is good. Don't get me wrong, like C is average, this is above average weapon. Because it shoots so slow, it means the value of each of your shots is much more, especially as it's doing 4000 damage a shot, that I cannot put it any higher. Next up we have the artillery, which is large grid only. It has both a turret variant and a static variant. The turret variant obviously has 2 shots, so the rounds per second it shoots is going to be doubled. I'll just mention that now. It auto reloads, again, all the weapons do it after this point. It has a range of 2000 meters, which is tied with the railgun, which we'll bring up in a minute, and that's the highest length for any weapon in the game. And with that, the static variant shoots 5 shots a minute, which is around 0.08 shots a second, and the turret variant, like I said, it has 2 barrels, fires 10 shots a minute, which is a shot every 6-ish seconds. Now, remember that the assault cannon did about 4000 damage a shot. This does 17,000 damage a shot, which is, you know, only 4 and a bit times higher than the assault cannon. This leads the artillery to have the highest DPS of any weapon so far. The static variant having around 14,000 DPS, and the turret having about 28,000 DPS, which is, you know, that's a lot of damage per second. It should also be mentioned that the artillery shells use uranium. Now, uranium isn't necessarily as rare as platinum, but again, it's quite an expensive resource to be firing every shot. It also has the highest iron cost per shot as well, which is quite interesting. Now again, as always, accuracy is very important to me, but this weapon just packs a massive punch. It has the highest DPS for a reason. Now the value of each shot is very high because obviously you're firing less of them, but they deal so much damage. I feel like you have to keep that in mind when using this weapon. Because it's so long range and you have the static range, you can pick off targets from a massive distance. Now, whilst you have a long range, it should be mentioned that at 2000 meters, you're going to really struggle to hit something. So whilst it does have the range, it's not necessarily as useful as it sounds. However, all that said, I'm going to put the artillery in B. Again, B is above average, and I think this weapon is very good, but just because these weapons fire so much faster now, I just don't think the artillery is as good. And just while I'm thinking about it, I've been looking at this and I think the Warhead needs to go down to D because it's just absolutely awful. It's so much worse than the missile launcher. And finally, Railgun. The Railgun doesn't have a turret variant, but it has a variant for both large and small grid. As with every weapon so far, it automatically reloads. It has the same range as the artillery of about 2000 meters, and it does a whopping 8000 damage per shot on the small grid variant and 50,000 damage per shot on the large grid variant, which means it just about 3 times as damage per shot as the artillery does. However, the small grid railgun has a 15-second timer between shots, which means it can shoot roughly 4 times a minute, and the large grid variant of the railgun shoots once every 60 seconds, meaning that whilst this weapon does a lot of damage, it has a much lower DPS than artillery, the assault cannon, the auto cannon, the Gatling gun, and even the missile launcher. And I think this is inherently the problem with the railgun. Yes, it does a lot of damage. It will pierce through 20 blocks of light armor and 4 blocks of heavy armor, but that's that's all it does. If you hit a component with this thing, great, you have like crippled the ship if you hit a reactor or a hydrogen tank. Again, you have to hit. And if you're firing once every 60 seconds, it's essentially a pot luck of whether or not you're actually going to do anything with it. To make it worse, the railgun also ricochets off armor, which means it could be even worse. You could hit the actual ship and it could just ping off in a random direction and do 0 damage. The railgun also boasts one of the most expensive ammo types, using 0.3 uranium a shot and 10 magnesium a shot, which means if you're using this thing constantly, you'll be burning through your ammo supplies. Well, obviously you won't be using this thing constantly because it sucks. I'm sorry to say, the railgun is not as good as artillery, and it's not as good as every other weapon on this list, except for maybe the missile launcher, because the missile launcher is just real bad. I'm going to put the railgun at C. It's perfectly acceptable. It's like a big sniper rifle, and if it hits, it's great, but this isn't Call of Duty. I can't flick my wrist and instantly headshot the enemy ship. I've got to aim, I've got to hit, and even if I hit, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to do any damage worthwhile. Overall, the railgun just isn't that great. We're not done though, as there's one weapon we kind of haven't mentioned that was also introduced in the Warfare 2 update, that being the custom turret controller. Now the custom turret controller allows you to build custom turrets, as you can imagine, which means you can use this to build whatever weapon you want, which means the custom turret controller can be anything. It can be all Gatling guns, it could be a mixture of Gatling guns and autocannons, it could just be one type of weapon. You could use it just to build railgun turrets if you wanted to, which would make it better than the railgun definitely, as the railgun requires you to aim your ship with gyroscopes, whereas if you had a railgun on a custom turret, you just have to aim the turret, which I guess would make the railgun a little bit better, but again, it's still not worthwhile. So the custom turret controller immediately goes in the S, as it basically can be the best weapon you can create. And if you're interested in making your own custom turrets, I recently made a video where I go over how to create them. Check it out in the top right or by clicking the link in the description below. So guys, here are my final rankings. What do you guys think? Let me know with a comment below. And if you enjoyed the video and want to see more videos like this, like and subscribe for more Space Engineers content.